I won't talk about the Gulag today, but I will. Let me take you back to another historical moment. Imagine a moment when suddenly everybody can be an author, and from suddenly everybody found it possible to publish, and everybody could write, and the men who had once controlled access to information have suddenly become irrelevant, and the establishment is crushed in a tide of new publications, and there are new ideas and new conflicts, and violence follows, and eventually war. And no, I'm not talking about the moment when we invented social media. I'm talking about the invention of the printing press, which was the radical 15th century technology that destabilized the church, as it then was in Europe, that undermined monarchies and brought us the Reformation. If there are Protestants in this room, however few, you might have think the Reformation was good, and others might disagree. But wherever you are on the religious split, you might also remember that in Europe, the Reformation eventually led to religious wars, to over 100 years of them. Catholics, Christians of different kinds, in Germany and France and England, split up into tribes. They fought for power. They burnt one another at the stake. And many centuries passed before Central Europe was at peace. But if my description of the 15th century did sound a little bit like the 21st century, that's not an accident, because I believe that we're living through an equally transformative and equally revolutionary moment. Why are so many elections in so many democracies taking such surprising turns? Why did nationalists, who all sound the same, are suddenly winning support in countries with very different economies and very different histories, from Poland and the Philippines to Brazil and Britain and the United States? Here's my guess, which is just that as the printing press broke the monopoly of the monks and priests who controlled the written word in the 15th century, the internet and social media have, in a very short period of time, undermined not only the business model used by democratic political media for the past 2 centuries, but the political institutions behind them as well. So look around at the world at many democracies. Everywhere you see that large newspapers and powerful broadcasters are disappearing. And these old-fashioned news organizations might have been flawed, and I know because I've worked for some of them, but many of them had as their founding principle at least a theoretical commitment to objectivity and to fact-checking and to the general public interest. And they served as a kind of filter, eliminating egregious conspiracy theories. They maintained a kind of independence, both from political parties, from the state, also from one another. More importantly, though, they created the possibility of a national conversation or a single debate. In many democracies now, there is no common debate, let alone a common narrative. People don't have the same facts. One group thinks that one set of things is true, another believes something quite different. Social media contributes to this phenomenon by allowing people to select the news and opinion that they want to hear, whether it's factual or not. And this tendency to seek out the familiar narratives, to seek out things that people agree with, has created homogeneous clusters online, sometimes known as echo chambers. So people get their news from their close-knit, ideologically similar friends on Facebook. Most members of an echo chamber have the same prevailing worldview. They interpret news through this common lens. And this phenomenon contributes to the growth of hyper-partisanship and intense polarization. And it has also led people to distrust so-called normal politics and politicians and political institutions. In many democracies, especially smaller ones, there's now no national debate at all. Instead, the internet, where readers and writers feel distant from one another and from the issues that they describe, has become the perfect medium for irony and for parody and cynical jokes. So it's not an accident that a plethora of ironic or parodic or joke political candidates are suddenly winning elections in countries as disparate as Iceland and Italy and Serbia. Some of these politicians are harmless and even positive, some are not. But it's also true that there is a generation of younger people in democracies who now treat elections as an opportunity to just show their disdain for democracy and their dislike of the whole system by voting for people who don't even pretend to have political views. Maybe this is unsurprising, since voting is maybe not so different from liking somebody on Facebook, except that it requires slightly more effort. This new information network has also had a lethal effect on our traditional Western political parties. Most of these parties were once based on real life or organizations. So once upon a time, the left in Europe and the United States had a very close relationship with trade unions, which were real institutions. People belonged to them, they went to meetings in real life, they had friends from those institutions. Whereas the center-right, particularly in Europe, but also even here in Britain, had a very close relationship to church organizations and to church clubs and to other civic institutions. But many of those groups don't exist anymore either, and the parties that they gave life to have not found a way to replace them. Nowadays, instead of looking to real institutions, many people now identify with groups or organizations that they find in the virtual world. New parties and new organizations are succeeding because they use social media to reach across social and geographic lines in ways that undermine traditional politics, both for better and for worse. I'm describing this phenomenon. I'm not making a judgment about it. There can be lots of good ways in which you can create new parties and movements. In fact, Macron's party, En Marche in France, is a creation of exactly the same phenomenon, people finding each other in new ways. At the same time, the Gilets jaunes, this protest movement in France, is produced by exactly the same mechanism. So you can produce this way parties that want to play constructive roles in public life and ones that want to be destructive, and it's too early to say whether it will be good or bad. Maybe the deeper point, though, is that this new information network, which is very deeply polarized, which has very big gaps between people, and which is no longer organized around a central discussion, is far more conducive than the old one was to the spread of false rumors. I know this is a subject you talked about in your last session. And these rumors can be either generated naturally or imposed from outside. And of course, it's also much more conducive to campaigns of both insider and outsider manipulation. I don't know how much you all know about the campaign that the Russian government used to try to manipulate the American election of 2016. But much of the results of that have now been published by the Mueller investigation and by others. But it's worth trying to understand. We know, for example, that the Russian operatives created fake Facebook pages that were designed to increase this polarization. So, for example, supporting very strong anti-immigration activists on the far right, on the one hand, or also creating fake Black Lives Matter kind of left-wing activists on the other. And the idea was to use the first group to support President Trump and to use the second group to persuade people not to vote for Hillary Clinton. We know that messages used by the Trump campaign were repeated by pro-Russian media and vice versa. We also know that Russian operatives hacked material from the Democratic Party headquarters, and that this material was then spun into millions of conspiracy theories. Most of the material was not very interesting or very important or very significant, but it was nevertheless proved possible to create campaigns around it. The most famous and most bizarre, most strange campaign was one created about the owners of a pizza restaurant in Washington who were close to people in the Hillary campaign, and the story was that the pizza restaurant was a a home for, was being used for pedophilia, and that the Hillary Clinton campaign was, was exploiting small children, sexually exploiting small children. Sounds crazy, but people believed it. One man even drove his car from his house in North Carolina, drove many hours to Washington, D.C., went to the pizza restaurant with a gun and said, "Open up, I'm here to free these children who have been captured." And only when he arrived did he discover that, of course, this is a fake story and it's not true. This tactic, both of using social media to increase polarization, as well as using hacked material or so-called secret material to create conspiracy theories, is part of a longer-term pattern. I had seen it happen before in several Central European countries, governments in Hungary and Slovakia and Macedonia and Poland in the past had also been brought down by secret tapes or leaks with Russian or Secret Service origins, and then by this so-called secret information being spun into hundreds of conspiracy theories. Divisive, polarizing, online disinformation campaigns have been used to great effect in Ukraine, more recently in Italy. In some cases, they have targeted particular politicians or companies as well. I think I'll confess and tell this room that I have a personal interest in these kinds of campaigns because a couple of years ago, I was the focus of one of them. It had some amusing elements, kind of spy novel elements. The Australian journalist who began writing about me had actually fled the United States in the 1980s following an FBI inquiry into his KGB connections. So this was a journalist who used a technique that has now become familiar. He wrote articles about me that contained some things that were true and some things that were lies. He wrote about my book contract and money that I had earned, which was supposedly mysterious income from the CIA. He posted them on these kind of quasi-serious Russian business websites originally. There's a website called Russia Direct that he used and some other ones. And then he let other people do the rest. And it was very interesting and kind of eye-opening to watch these stories move through this very carefully created system that I realized had been constructed for this purpose. And so eventually these fake articles written for me by this journalist, he was based in Moscow, were echoed or quoted in dozens of places. And so on other websites that had ties to Russian business, of course on Russia Today, the English language Russian state television, on American websites, on Polish websites. And this continued until eventually WikiLeaks, which became famous also in the US election campaign, in November 2015, tweeted some of these articles to its followers, to its 4 million followers. It was very weird to see fake stories about myself circulating, but it was also very educational. As I watched this story move around the internet, I saw how this world of fake website and fake news exists to reinforce one another and to give falsehood credence. Many of the websites quoted not the original source, so not the original journalist, but one another. There were a lot more of them than I had realized, though I also learned that many of their followers were not real people. They were bots. They were bits of computer code that were programmed to imitate people. This is when I first learned about political botnets and how they can be a force in electoral politics. Again, this is 2014, 2015, even though at that time most people still didn't know what they were. In my case, this story was completely unimportant and it didn't matter. I'm not a politician. I'm not running for office. Very few people I knew paid any attention to it or cared. But we can all imagine circumstances like that where such networks could make a difference, and of course we then saw it we've seen it in several elections and other cases. And the possible uses of this kind of internet manipulation can go well beyond standard electoral politics. Let me give you another example, and this one I'm afraid it's Russian again. Last spring, no, it's not last spring, a couple of years ago, the US Defense Department uncovered a Russian effort to hijack more than 10,000 Twitter users at the Pentagon. So messages were sent to people, members of the armed forces, linking to stories about sports or celebrities, but when you clicked them, the links took the users to a Russian-controlled server, and automatically the server downloaded a program that allowed Russian hackers to take control of the victim's Twitter account. So this scheme was uncovered, but think about what could have been done if it had succeeded. So imagine the chaos that could be unleashed if authentic Defense Department accounts, real ones, with the authority of the US Armed Forces behind them, began tweeting disinformation. You know, what if this happened during a natural disaster? What if it happened during a terrorist attack? What if the terrorist attack was planned and then the campaign, disinformation campaign, happened afterwards? As each tweet backed up the others and other messages began amplifying the message further, you could get real panic and confusion. Of course, the Defense Department doesn't have to be the only target. What if the target had been those fake Black Lives Matter accounts, or that the Russians used in 2016 during a race riot? You know, what if they began calling for violence? And might not that have long-term political effects? Somewhat unfairly, I've now cited a couple of Russian examples, but of course this is misleading. Russian secret services were simply better at doing this, I think, earlier on for historical reasons. There were departments of the FSB that were thinking about this before other people understood it. You know, and this is a very cheap way for Russia to intervene in other countries' politics, but it can be done by many others. You know, other governments, other political movements, private companies. It's not very difficult to enter into this game. It doesn't take very much time. It's not very high tech. It doesn't require any special equipment. We can see similar disinformation campaigns now. There were many in the Mexican elections, which somebody described to me as a bot war. They can be used in British elections. They can be used in elections all over the world. The issue for democracies now is what to do about it. You know, if only, you know, many people say, well, shouldn't somebody be in charge of stopping these campaigns, or supporting the traditional press, or fixing the partisan divides? And here, of course, is the problem. There isn't anybody who's responsible for solving it. Democratic governments don't censor the internet, at least not yet. They don't fund independent media, and if they do, they would cease to be independent. The militaries of France or the United States are not set up to fight information wars. NATO has tanks, but it's not going to wade into the social media wars that go on in its own member states. Counterintelligence services don't do that. This isn't their job to think about polarization or conspiracy theories. Tech companies could help solve this problem, but they don't really have an incentive to do that. This new information network is also where Google and Facebook are making money. Besides, there isn't going to be a technical gadget or program that can measure the truth. That's not going to happen. There aren't going to be investments that can persuade people to read quality media that no longer exists. And also, I don't think that censorship from Google or Facebook in the long term will be any more acceptable or successful than censorship from the government. The truth, I think, is that the answer to this problem, which is, I think we're just beginning to understand and have some sense of how it works, there are going to be multiple solutions. They're going to come from a wide range of institutions. The solution will come from people at universities, at think tanks, at newspapers. There's research being done at my little team at the LSE, among others, which is looking at ways you could bring echo chambers together, reach people who are distrustful. There are journalists who are talking about reinventing what they do in order to find better ways of reaching people and create greater levels of trust. There are people designing media literacy campaigns. There are fact-checking websites. There are people trying to understand how we can make sure that fact-checkers are believed. But part of the answer to this problem, which has I know you have a different version of this in Russia, but part of the answer is going to be people like you. And by that I don't mean, you know, you as students or you as people at the seminar. I mean you as citizens, because it's going to be very important over the next several years and even decades for the inhabitants of democracies and countries that would like to be democracies to support new forms of media that might capture the hearts and minds of voters and not just their intention. Everybody is going to have to teach children how to be literate in the 21st century to help them learn how to distinguish propaganda from real stories on the internet. Everyone might have to find ways of interacting more in public life, and this is a message I would give to people who live in democracies like the United Kingdom, as well as to countries that are less democratic like Russia. All of us are going to have to learn how to participate more in public life than we used to. Because in my view, the revival of democracy in the West, which for so long was dependent on reliable information, is going to be a major civilizational project in an era of unreliable information. And just like it took hundreds of years to end the religious wars in Europe, it may take some time before solid solutions to this problem are found too. The change in the way that people get and process political information is really basic. It's really profound. Every time it's changed, politics have changed along with it. I spoke about the printing press. You can talk about the invention of radio. The people who first learned how to use radio brilliantly and well were Hitler and Stalin. The response to that use of radio, as you know, took a long time to come. It came in the form of the BBC, in the form of other forms of public broadcasting, but it took a long time to think through. At the end of the day, I think we have to just hope that the very basic human desire not to be fooled wins the day, and also that deeper values, principles of tolerance, respect for rule of law, the importance of strong and neutral political institutions turn out to be stronger than this inchoate and dissatisfied anger that you can find online. Thank you very much.